Autumn, 1883. Eastern Missouri. The wind came down from the river bluffs in cold, ragged gusts, tearing the last corn husks from their brittle stalks and hurling them against the leaning split-rail fences. Above the ridge, a stand of elm trees bent and creaked under the strain, their roots gripping at soil littered with old bones of brick and charred timber. Here stood, or rather sagged, the blackened skeleton of the Carrington estate. In Hampton, the locals had long since learned to take the longer road when driving cattle past this place. They swore that when the night fog rolled in off the river, you could hear voices, women's voices, rising muffled from somewhere deep beneath the earth. No one claimed to have gone close enough to find out. It was only by accident that the ground gave up part of its secret. That October morning, a small team of surveyors had been clearing the warped remains of a collapsed barn on the Carrington property when one of their shovels struck iron. Beneath a layer of frozen soil lay a hatch, rusted but intact, with a heavy ring set into its center. When they pried it open, the smell that rose from below was thick with rot and the sharp, ghostly sting of chloroform. The passage sloped steeply into blackness, the stone floor furred with decades of dust. In that dust lay shackles, their locks eaten with corrosion, brown glass apothecary bottles still bearing labels in fading script, and on a warped table, a ledger whose spine had swollen with damp. The entries began in 1846 and ended abruptly in 1865. Each line bore a name and a date, penned in a hand so precise it seemed almost mechanical. Beside each name, a single notation, shipped. This was not the history Hampton liked to remember. For nearly 20 years, the Carringtons had lived among them, attending church, trading cotton upriver, sending their children to the same school as any other planter's family. But they had also been hiding something vast. Something that reached far beyond county lines, and deep enough to keep even the most dangerous rumors from taking root. Silas Carrington, patriarch, was a man of few words and fewer smiles, yet he held more land than anyone in the valley. His stone house, set far from the road and approached by a winding drive through dark trees, was the quiet origin of a story that would end with more than 40 young women missing, all of them gone on the night they believed themselves to be brides. Early March, 1852. The Osage wind still had a bite, lifting soot from the riverboat stacks and peppering the levee with grit that tasted like coal. Andrew Hunt came upriver from St. Louis with a borrowed carpet-bag and a notebook bound in red morocco, telling himself he was visiting family. He had been a printer's devil at 16, a court reporter at 20, and by 24 a stringer whose byline occasionally appeared beneath murders and mill fires. He knew how silence behaved on a page. In Hampton, silence didn't sit, it leaned forward, listening. His cousin Sarah had written bright, breathless letters that winter, lilac ink, loops like ribbons, about lace being fitted and a ring with river light trapped in the stone. She wrote of dinners at the Carrington house, where the youngest son, Julius, read aloud from Sir Walter Scott and played the flute softly afterwards so as not to wake the servants. She wrote of a dressmaker from St. Genevieve who whispered that the Carrington weddings were unlike any in the county. Private, select, refined. Her last letter arrived February 28th. "Tomorrow night," she'd written. "Tomorrow I shall be Sarah Hunt no longer. Pray for a clear sky." Then the pen trailed into a blot. Andrew stepped off the packet on March 9th and felt at once that the town had changed shape around an absence. The livery boy who took his bag did not ask who he was visiting. At the boarding house, Mrs. Fairley, a Baptist with wrists like cart axles, offered a room and, unprompted, a prayer that God would drive bad weather from good souls. When Andrew asked casually after the wedding that had lit up the ridge the previous week, her mouth narrowed as if against a sour taste. "Private affair," she said, folding and refolding a dishcloth. "Family only." Hampton in early spring wore the look of a place that had been washed and hurried back onto its hook while still damp. Chimneys smoked with unseasoned wood. Chickens scratched in channels of thawing mud. Along Front Street, German grocers sold seed potatoes by the peck and sugar by the cone, while the Irish bricklayers' boys, freckled, rope-armed, lofted a hoop between them and kept their eyes on the ground whenever a plantation wagon rattled past. Cotton bales came down the river, pork went up, and politics pulled in doorways with the bitter smell of spilled coffee. Everyone knew what Washington argued over. No one spoke aloud of what came and went by night. He went to the postmaster first. Mr. Colfax was a mild man with a scalp like polished pewter and a fondness for anecdotes that never quite arrived. "Miss Sarah Hunt?" "Ah, yes. A charming hand." He ruffled the pigeonholes, found nothing. "We see brides off every spring," he offered, as if that explained departures with no forwarding address. "Young ladies marry. They go away." "Where?" Andrew asked. Colfax blinked at him mildly. "Away," he repeated. At Yoder's general store, the talk paused when Andrew entered. He bought a pencil, a twist of tobacco, and the latest Missouri Republican. A farmer he didn't know stood studying the shelf of lamp oils so long that the wick trimmer in his hand trembled. "Here tells St. Louis is putting in more street lamps," the farmer said to no one. "You can see your face in the river at midnight." Behind the counter, Yoder coughed and found something very fascinating to count. Andrew wrote that night by the boarding-house window while a storm rattled in from the west. He noted those small cowardices that suggest larger ones, how people repeated each other's phrases without quite meaning them, how the town's clock tower struck 12 twice when the wind surged, how the ridge lay black against the sky like a jawbone. He slept poorly and woke to hammering, somewhere uphill, measured, patient, metallic. He walked out along the road that rose toward the old Carrington place, Booth's *King at Thaw. The fields lay furrowed and done, the corn shocks not yet burned. He paused where a narrow lane cut through scrub oak, and from there he saw the house, a 2-story mass of limestone and shadow, its windows reflecting the low, silver sky. Andrew had read enough advertisements for gas fitting in the city to recognize the even steadiness of piped flame, and yet no mains ran here. The light in those windows was too uniform for whale oil, too unwavering for candles and draft. It made the house look like a counting machine that happened to breathe. A carriage came down the drive and turned toward him with the quiet arrogance of money. At the reins sat a coachman in bottle-green livery, jaw square beneath a trim of frost. Beside him, a younger man watched Andrew with an expression that was either curiosity or the rehearsal of it. "Morning," Andrew said, stepping into the ditch to let them pass. The younger man tipped his hat the smallest necessary degree. "Sir?" His eyes were a Carrington gray, not quite blue, not quite slate, the color of river ice over mud. When the wheels reached the ruts, Andrew saw the crates stacked in the carriage bed, each stamped with a stenciled symbol, a circle bisected by a vertical line. Not initials. A mark. He took the long way back, across a meadow that kept its frost in shaded hollows, and asked himself how a reporter without a paper might proceed. His editor in St. Louis had taught him to mistrust clean stories. "If it reads like a sermon," the man liked to say, "you haven't looked in the ash pit." Sarah's friend at the dressmaker's, a girl named Lucy Lowe, dark-eyed, quick, worked in a brick storefront off the square. Andrew found her pinning loops of ribbon to a mannequin and humming, "Lorena," under her breath. When he introduced himself, she flushed as if he had caught her at some private sin. "Miss Lowe," he said, "my cousin wrote about you. She said you have a steady hand and a kind word." Lucy's mouth crumpled, and for a moment Andrew thought she would speak. Then her gaze darted to the doorway, where a woman in a bonnet had paused with a bolt of muslin in her arms. "We don't gossip here," Lucy said, with the practiced sweetness of those who have been instructed not to. "If you want a hem mended, I can help you." He left his card on the counter. It did not say journalist. It said simply Andrew Hunt, printer. He had learned that people spoke more freely to tradesmen who promised ink than to men who promised headlines. Toward dusk he took supper at the tavern across from the courthouse, ham, coarse bread, weak coffee, and listened. Men mentioned crops, freight rates, a lame mule. No one said the name Carrington. But an old river pilot at the end of the bar, hands like driftwood, told a story about a steamboat that used no whistle when she came upriver after midnight, how her stacks drew only a breathing sound, how she moored at a private dock with no lantern hoisted. "Sound carries on fog," the pilot said. "Smart captains keep their throats shut." Name? Andrew asked. The pilot smiled into his cup. Boats have names. Owners have friends. Back at his room, he unfolded Sarah's last letter and ran his fingers over the pressure points where her pen had dug into paper. In the margin, she had sketched the Carrington seal as a lark, a circle with a stroke through it. A sun with a staff, she'd called it. He held the memory of the crate marks beside the doodle and felt, for the first time, the cold edge of pattern. In my trade, people imagine that revelation arrives like thunder. Often it comes like mold, slow, patient, working in the dark until the shape of what it eats becomes apparent by what it consumes. In Hampton, that slow working had gnawed away sight, appetite, courage. It had also eaten my cousin's letters. He blew out the lamp and lay listening to the town's nerves, cartwheels, a drunk's half-song, the brittle clack of branches. Somewhere a dog barked at nothing. Somewhere a hammer kept its careful time. I asked myself a question I have since asked in other towns with other ash pits. If everyone turns away at once, does the turning produce a wind? Morning brought a thin, hard light and the creak of wagon springs. Andrew went to the river. The dockmaster's ledger, when he finally bullied his way to it with the insistence of a man who had once kept court minutes to the last comma, gave him a sequence that made his heart beat higher. On the night after each private wedding at the Carrington place, a small side-wheeler tied up at the family landing and loosed again before dawn, taking no freight, recording no passengers, paying in coin that left no name. The column of entries that month had been misplaced. But the previous years spoke plain enough. I am not on assignment, he wrote that evening. Yet I may have found one. The town pretends to be deaf. The river is not. Water remembers every foot that steps into it, so does ink. He folded the page into the red morocco, laid his pencil across it, and listened again to the ridge. The house above kept its even light. Somewhere behind that pale glow, people rehearsed their lines. And Sarah, if she still walked beneath that roof, had fallen silent. It was a chance errand that led Andrew Hunt to Hannah West. He had gone out to the western edge of town looking for a man who dealt in old maps, but the man was away, and the lane brought him instead to a small, tilting frame house with a scatter of wind-fallen apples rotting in the yard. A woman in a dark wool shawl stood by the fence, poking the earth with a stick. She was perhaps 40, though the hollows beneath her eyes gave her an older cast. The orchard behind her climbed toward the ridge, and beyond the bare trees, Andrew could see the gray bulk of the Carrington house, distant but dominant, like a fortress watching over the valley. You're too close to their land, she said without introduction. Her voice was dry, without malice. Andrew explained himself, a cousin gone silent, a wish to learn the truth. At Sarah's name, Hannah West's gaze sharpened. I've seen things, she said. Not the kind you tell in the store. Inside her house the air was thick with the smell of apples gone sweet to vinegar. She poured him coffee so strong it left grit at the bottom of the cup, and began without preamble. 3 times, she said. I've seen it. Always the night after one of their weddings. Covered wagons, canvas tied down tight, come rolling in after dark. Men with lanterns go between the house and the barn. If anyone passes, the lights go out. She told him of crates dragged from the barn and into the wagons, leaving black streaks on the boards. Once she had stood in her orchard and heard what she swore were muffled cries. The barn's got a cellar, she added. Dug it one summer, said it was for grain storage. But no one ever saw a bushel go in or out. Not in daylight. Andrew asked why she had not spoken to the sheriff. Hannah gave a short, humorless laugh. In Hampton you don't go to law about the Carringtons. Folks who do either vanish or leave in the night with whatever they can carry. I've got no kin left to bury me, so I keep my mouth shut. The clock on her mantel ticked loud in the silence that followed. Outside, the wind shook the apple branches, scattering a few last leaves. Andrew pressed her gently for detail. The wagons were driven by men she didn't know, their speech clipped and formal. The crates were long, narrow, heavy enough to take 2 men each. And always, the barn afterward sat dark for a week, as if resting from its work. Before leaving, he asked if she would put her account in writing. Hannah shook her head. Words on paper are easier to burn than a body. That night, Andrew returned to town by the back road, keeping to the hedgerows. From a distance, he saw the Carrington barn, a low shape against the horizon. A single lantern moved briefly within, then winked out. The air seemed to carry a faint, medicinal tang, though the wind was from the north. Back in his room, he wrote down every word Hannah had said, knowing that in a place like Hampton, memory was a poor defense. The Carringtons were careful, but patterns have a way of showing themselves to the right eyes. And Hannah West's orchard, half forgotten at the edge of their land, had been watching for years. Andrew began at the river. Hampton's dock was little more than a worn timber platform, but it carried the scent of distant ports, tar, tobacco, molasses, and the quiet knowledge of things that passed unseen. The dockmaster, a wiry man with a sunken cheek, resisted Andrew's questions until shown a half-eagle coin. Even then, he spoke as if the river itself might overhear. "There's a boat," he said. "Sidewheeler, painted dark. Don't whistle when she ties in. Don't stay long. Comes only after certain occasions on the ridge." Ledger pages confirmed it. After each Carrington wedding, the same vessel docked in darkness and slipped away before dawn, heading south towards St. Louis, then New Orleans. The cargo columns were blank. No names appeared in the passenger lines. In St. Louis, Andrew followed the trail into the underbelly of the port, where stevedores drank and gamblers lost their shirts to rigged faro tables. It was there he found Isaac Hope, a former hired man from the Carrington estate. Hope's left hand trembled when Andrew bought him a whiskey, and his eyes darted to every corner of the room before he spoke. "They keep 'em in the barn cellar," Hope said, voice barely above the clatter of glasses. "Stone walls, iron rings set into the floor. Laudin' 'em in the food to keep 'em quiet. Sometimes chloroform when there's trouble." Hope told of a routine precise as any clock. A wedding night, private and swift. Guests, if any, all kin or close business allies. After supper, the bride disappeared from sight. By dawn, she was gone entirely, replaced by sealed crates loaded onto a covered wagon. The route was efficient. Hampton to St. Louis by river, St. Louis to New Orleans aboard discreet packet steamers. There, brokers arranged passage to ports in the Caribbean, Brazil, Venezuela, places where pale-skinned women could fetch staggering sums and markets spoken of only in backrooms. "The Carringtons aren't alone," Hope warned. "They're just one spoke in a wheel. Sheriffs, ship captains, customs men, all get their share. That's why nobody talks." Andrew returned to Hampton under a lowering sky, the clouds like damp wool overhead. He saw now how the pieces fit. The unbroken chain from a small stone house in Missouri to distant ports half a world away. And somewhere along that chain might still be Sarah, held in Dr*********** twilight, her name already crossed from one ledger and written into another. The closer he drew to the truth, the more the town seemed to change around him. Strangers lingered too long outside his inn. A rider followed him halfway to the post road before turning back. The woman at the boarding house stopped leaving his supper in the front room. Instead, she carried it silently to his door, eyes fixed on the tray. On the ridge, the Carrington place grew watchful. Servants who once offered a nod now looked past him as though he were smoke. The barn stood with its doors closed, but faint hammering sometimes drifted on the wind, measured and deliberate. One afternoon, he passed the dock and saw barrels being loaded onto a flatboat under the Carrington mark. The dockmen moved quickly, their glances restless. He caught a whiff of something sharp, chemical, the same odor he'd smelled from the barn that night after visiting Hannah West. He began sending reports north to a federal contact in St. Louis, a man whose integrity he trusted more than the county sheriff's. Telegraph messages were too dangerous. He sent them by trusted river hands, folded between sheets of shipping manifests. Andrew knew he was running out of time. Another Carrington wedding was being whispered of, the intended bride a merchant's daughter from across the county. 3 days, Hannah West had told him, from vows to vanishing. The steamboat's return could be counted as faithfully as the phases of the moon. If Sarah was still alive, the next departure might be his only chance. The machinery was in motion again, and once it began to turn, it did not stop for anything short of force. Snow still lingered in the shaded gullies, but the river ran high with spring melt, its surface brown and fast. Andrew left Hampton before dawn, riding hard for St. Louis with the Carrington timetable in his head. The next steamboat south would come in 3 nights. If Sarah was aboard, it would be the last trace of her before the sea swallowed the trail. He bypassed the county sheriff entirely. The man's office, with its polished rifle and dustless ledgers, reeked of Carrington coin. Instead, Andrew went to the federal marshal's bureau on Olive Street, where the air smelled of damp paper and coal smoke. There he found Deputy Marshal Ezra Pike, a wiry veteran with eyes like ground glass and no patience for local politics. "You're telling me you've got witnesses, a pattern of disappearances, and a steamboat schedule," Pike said after hearing Andrew out. "You've also got 3 days. That means we move now, or not at all." By nightfall, Pike had gathered 6 men, marshals from outlying districts not yet in any planter's pocket. They spoke little, only checked their carbines and the brass fittings on their handcuffs. One produced a small coil of fuse and 2 sticks of blasting powder. "In case we need the barn opened in a hurry," he said. Andrew returned to Hampton the next morning. The town was quieter than he'd ever seen it. Curtains twitched at his passing. On the ridge, smoke rose from the Carrington chimney in a thin, steady column, and the barn doors stood wide. Men carried long crates inside. The sound of hammering echoed over the fields. He avoided the main road, circling instead through Hannah West's orchard. She met him among the twisted apple trunks, breath clouding in the chill air. "It's tonight," she said. "The wagons will roll after dark." They parted quickly. Andrew went back to the inn, packed only what he could carry at a run, and waited. At dusk, the marshals arrived in 2 covered wagons, their wheels muffled in sacking. Pike laid out the plan. 2 teams would come in from opposite sides of the ridge, sealing the road to the river. Andrew would go with the group taking the barn, as he was the only one who had heard Hope's description of the cellars. Night settled thick and moonless. Somewhere down by the water, a whippoorwill called. The Carrington house glowed with its unnatural, steady light. The barn was dark, but the smell of fresh sawn wood and that bitter chemical tang drifted even to the hedgerows. They moved at a crouch. The first shout came when a sentry stumbled into the marshal's path and went down under the butt of a rifle. Then they were running, boots thudding on frozen ground, hands wrenching at the barn's double doors. The doors held until Pike himself swung the rifle butt and the hinges tore free. The smell hit them like a physical thing, mold, damp stone, and something sharper that caught in the throat. Lanterns showed a bare floor, then a trapdoor at its center, iron-ringed. Andrew dropped into the cellar first. The light caught on rows of narrow cells, women slumped against the walls in torn dresses, eyes wide in shock. Chains clinked as they tried to move. A few flinched from the lantern's glare. One murmured in a tongue Andrew didn't know. "Sarah!" he called, voice echoing. For a moment, nothing, then a thin, wavering "Andrew?" from the farthest cell. She was there, gaunt and pale, but alive. The key from Pike's ring turned with difficulty in the rusted lock. She fell against him, too weak to stand without his arm. Above, shouts and G***ing fire. Silas Carrington had tried for the dock, but marshals cut him off in the dark. 2 of his sons were dragged from the house, their fine coats torn, their faces gray with rage. In the study, they found ledgers stacked like scripture, names, dates, sums, destinations written in that same unnervingly neat hand. When the last woman was brought up into the night air, some wept, some stared blankly at the trees as if unsure they were real. The marshals moved them toward the wagons, wrapping them in blankets against the cold. Pike gave Andrew a curt nod. "You've got your proof. Now we see if the courts will use it." But Andrew knew the fight was only half done. The machinery had been stopped here, tonight, but beyond Hampton, other wheels were still turning. The raid's noise carried far across the valley, the sharp crack of G***ing fire, the hollow slam of doors kicked in, the echo of voices shouting commands. Hampton's people stayed in their houses, lamps turned low, pretending to be deaf. But from behind curtains, More than one pair of eyes followed the thin stream of lanterns winding down from the ridge toward the road. The marshals moved with grim efficiency. The Carrington house yielded more than they had hoped, not just ledgers and letters, but maritime charts with penciled notations marking obscure river landings. There were receipts in Spanish and Portuguese, and slips of paper with names crossed out in red ink. In a locked drawer they found small ivory tokens, each scratched with a date. Andrew could not shake the feeling that these were not souvenirs, but tally marks. Silas Carrington himself was hauled back up the slope between two marshals, his fine coat dusted with mud from a failed dash toward the river. His face, pale in the lamplight, showed no fear, only calculation, as though he were already working the angles of escape. His sons were less composed. The eldest cursed in a steady stream, while Julius, the youngest, stared fixedly at the ground, lips pressed tight. Below the barn, the cellar was emptied cell by cell. Some of the women stumbled into the open air, others had to be carried. The bitter night wind hit their faces and brought a kind of stunned clarity, as though the cold itself reminded them they were still alive. Sarah clung to Andrew's sleeve, silent except for a shuddering breath when the trapdoor closed for the last time behind her. Pike kept his men focused, herding both prisoners and rescued toward the wagons. "No delays," he ordered. "We make the river road by dawn or we'll have company." He knew, as Andrew did, that Carrington influence might still reach out from the county seat before morning. In the dining room, the marshals stacked the ledgers, letters, and charts into a trunk for transport. Andrew leafed through one book and found Sarah's name, written in that same precise script, followed by the notation shipped, March 2, 1852. The date chilled him. It was the day after her wedding, and 3 weeks before he arrived in Hampton. She had been marked for disappearance from the moment the vows were spoken. Outside, the barn loomed black against the stars. Pike stood a moment at its doors, then struck a match and touched it to the heap of straw in the corner. Flame licked upward, catching the dry timbers. "No one uses this again," he said. The fire spread quickly, light flickering over the rescued faces in the wagons. Some turned away, others stared as though to memorize the sight of the place burning. The ride down from the ridge was slow and tense. Twice they stopped to listen, once for the distant roll of wheels on the frozen road, once for voices that never came closer. The marshals kept their rifles ready. At the river landing, the party split. Pike would take the prisoners and evidence north by steamer to St. Louis. Andrew would travel with the rescued women under guard to a safe house in a neighboring county. The parting was brief, a clasp of hands, a murmured, "You've done well," and then they were each swallowed by their separate roads. In the wagon, Sarah sat between two other women, their faces shadowed under blankets. She spoke little, answering Andrew's questions with a nod or shake of the head. But when the first pale light touched the horizon, she looked at him and said, "It wasn't just here. They talked about places in Alabama. And Georgia. The same marks on the crates." Andrew wrote the words down before the frost had melted from the ruts. The Carringtons were one limb of a tree whose roots ran deep across the south, and now he had proof it could be cut. Behind them, the ridge was hidden by smoke from the burning barn, curling into the morning like a signal no one in Hampton would admit seeing. The trial opened in St. Louis on a damp April morning, the courthouse steps slick with rain. Word had spread quickly. By mid-morning, the corridors were crowded with reporters, merchants, and society women who had never before set foot in a criminal hearing. The Carrington name drew them like a lantern in fog. Silas Carrington entered in irons, flanked by 2 marshals. His sons followed, each wearing the stiff expressions of men who had been told their fortunes might yet be salvaged. Behind them came crates of evidence, the ledgers, charts, ivory tokens, and letters taken from the ridge. In one crate, wrapped in oilcloth, were the rusted shackles from the barn cellar, mute testimony more powerful than any speech. Sarah was called first among the rescued women. She stepped carefully to the witness stand, her hands twisting in her lap as she spoke. She described the wedding night, the sudden drowsiness after a single glass of wine, the blur of voices and movement, and waking in the stone cell with others whose faces she barely saw in the gloom. The courtroom was silent but for the scratching of reporters' pens. Hannah West's testimony came next. She recounted the wagons, the crates, the muffled cries in the orchard nights. Her eyes never once met Silas Carrington's. She looked instead at the judge, as if daring him to look away. The defense tried to paint the witnesses as mistaken or malicious, bitter spinsters, frightened women, outsiders stirring trouble. But the ledgers told a story that could not be erased. 43 names, each followed by a date, and the same single word, shipped. The prosecution laid the books open on a long table where the jury could see the pages for themselves. Ezra Pike testified last, his account spare and precise. He described the raid, the rescue, and the evidence seized. When asked why he had chosen to burn the barn, Pike's voice was flat. Because leaving it standing would invite someone to fill it again. The verdict came after 2 days' deliberation. Silas Carrington and 3 of his sons were found guilty on charges of unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, and transport of persons for illicit purposes. Yet the sentences were lighter than the public expected, 10 to 15 years in state prison for the elder men, less for the younger. Rumors whispered of bribes passed quietly, of debts forgiven in exchange for influence. For the women, there was no true restitution. Some returned to families. Others had no one left and were placed in charitable homes. Sarah chose to remain in St. Louis under Andrew's protection, her health too fragile for the long journey east. She never again spoke of the cellar except in testimony. During the war years that followed, Union troops passing through Hampton burned what remained of the Carrington estate. Some said Pike himself had ridden the order, ensuring the barn's foundations were torn up and the stones scattered. The ridge was left bare but for the blackened chimneys and the wind in the trees. Andrew kept the red morocco notebook in which he had first recorded Hannah West's words. In later years, he would add clippings from other cases, raids in Louisiana and Alabama that uncovered cellars not unlike the one on the ridge, crates marked with the same circle and stroke emblem. The network had been wounded, but not destroyed. By the time Andrew left Missouri for good, Hampton had returned to its silence. The locals did not speak of the trial or the barn, and strangers passing through rarely noticed the ridge at all. Yet on certain autumn evenings, when the river fog rose and drifted inland, the shape of the old house seemed to stand again in the mist, its windows glowing with that steady, unnatural light. Some claimed to hear voices in the fog, soft, almost musical, as if carried from a great distance underground. Others dismissed it as the wind in the orchard. But Hannah West, long before she passed, told Andrew she believed the ridge remembered. And in his heart, he knew she was right.